Today on the Art Class Curator Podcast, I'm sharing a personal story about a recent art encounter that called me to action and helped me cope with a profound tragedy. Please join me in considering how art consoles and restores us, and what we can do to help our students utilize art to connect, heal, and take action. And midway through the episode, we have a surprise guest visitor. This is Cindy Ingram, and welcome to the Art Class Curator Podcast, where we're taking art out of the dark with thoughtful explorations and in-depth interviews designed to ignite curiosity and delight in art classrooms everywhere. Hi, everybody. It's Cindy Ingram, and today on the podcast, I thought I would share some of the thoughts that have been sort of going through my head over the last 6 months or so about art in times of tragedy. Now, school just started here where I live in Texas, and there are a bunch of new security measures in place for my daughter's classrooms and school. They are in the 4th grade and the 1st grade. And, we have brand new security passes that parents have to get. And then, for the first time, I think, in my role as a parent in a school, I have noticed the location of the classroom in relationship to the doors. And it's beginning of the semester, and last spring we had, I don't know how many school shootings and how many students died in schools because of them being gunned down. And it's really quite terrifying to see that my daughter's class is at the end of the hall, right by the door, and especially hit a lot of us art teachers hard this past May when art teachers were among the victims in the school shooting in Santa Fe, Texas, which is outside of Galveston in the Houston area. And I wrote this episode outline right after that event. And this is me coming back to that outline a few months later. And I'm going to try to do it justice of the thoughts that I had when I wrote this. But I just wanted to talk about how art can help us through these sort of situations and how we need art in our life to provide solace and to provide a creative outlet for our students and to help them through the struggles that they have in their lives. The problem with all of these school shootings is complicated, and there are a lot of factors, but our role as teachers is to create a safe space for our students, and that hopefully through having teachers that love their students and having more vulnerability be accepted in the world and more kindness in the world, that we can help to whatever degree we can. Okay, so I went to Houston in May, and it was a few days after that school shooting, and I drove down to go see Hamilton. So Hamilton was touring, and it visited Houston, and of course I drove down from Dallas so that I could see it, and I'm obsessed with Hamilton. I've already seen it once in Chicago, but I will see it, anytime I can. So we drove down to Houston, and it was 3 days, I think, after the tragedy in Santa Fe, Texas. And I think, like a lot of people, I'm sensitive. And so I don't follow the news as much as I should because I get too emotional about it. If I think too hard about what's going on in the world, if I think too hard about the children and the parents who are suffering and the teachers who are suffering, then I don't know that I would be able to get out of bed, So the thing about me going to see Hamilton is I wasn't able to look away, and I wasn't able to distract myself from the horrors of the world. So if you aren't familiar with Hamilton, Hamilton is a Broadway musical about the life of Alexander Hamilton, but it is shown through hip hop music and rap music, and it is a very diverse cast, and they're in period dress, and they are telling the true story of Hamilton, but they're doing it more contemporary ways through the music and the dance and such. It's a beautiful, wonderful work of art, probably one of the best works of art I've ever experienced. It tops for me a lot of the great paintings, it's up there. But anyway, in Hamilton, there is a moment where, and I'm not giving it away because it's history, I guess, but Hamilton's son, well, we know that Hamilton was in the famous duel with Aaron Burr and Hamilton dies, but what the play covers too is the loss of Hamilton's son, Philip. And there's a period in the musical where Philip is shot and they're with him when he's dying and after he's died. And I'm watching Hamilton and his wife, Eliza, mourn for their child at the same time as, less than an hour away or at the same time as an hour away, we have parents who are actually going through this right now, that their children have been shot and they are mourning the death of their children. And so it was a profound moment for me because I wasn't able to look away. And I wrote down some of the quotes. I outlined this in the car on the way home when I was driving home. But some of the quotes from the music is, there are moments that the words don't reach. There's suffering too terrible to name. You hold your child as tight as you can, and then you push away the unimaginable. And I do that. I found myself doing that. And I think a lot of people do that. But I think we can use art both as a way to connect with the world and feel more a part of it, but also use art as a way to respond to tragedy and to help ourselves through. That art can both teach us about ourselves and help us process what we're trying to process. And then art can also call us to action. I left that musical. I was still crying when I left. I cried, I wept from that part of I wept the whole thing, but from that moment, I just could not stop crying. And it called me to action that, while I was there experiencing this, that my avoidance of talking about these tragedies and my avoidance of watching the news and calling my representatives and that sort of thing, that's not helping. That yes, I need to protect myself and my emotions as best as I can, but also I need to do more. And I think that's probably why I'm filming or recording this podcast is, I feel like that show called me to do more, to have this discussion and to not shy away from it. And even though I'm here crying while recording a podcast, that, I need to engage. And that show helped me do that. Now, I also listened to this podcast that I highly recommend. It's called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And if you've interacted with me at all over the last few months, you know that I'm obsessed with this podcast. I talk about it all the time. So what Harry Potter and the Sacred Text is a podcast where they read Harry Potter as if it is a sacred text. They go through chapter by chapter. They read through the chapter through a particular theme like love and belonging, commitment, hospitality, just things those are the ones that just popped in my head. But each chapter they read through a different lens. And then they also go through and do some sort of spiritual practice where they dive into the text even more, which I'm going to talk about, a little bit more later in this episode. And then after they do that, they bless one of the characters and they connect one of the characters with people today. So for example, in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, book 2, Ginny Weasley, is sort of pushed to the side through the whole episode. And it turns out she's this major character who's been struggling the entire time. And so, they'll bless Ginny for her invisibility, and for people, they'll bless people who feel invisible in their lives. And, it's a really wonderful connection to the world. And they're using this wonderful text that I have a personal connection to help me think about myself differently, to think through the issues in my life and how I interact with the world. And they're creating positive, wonderful change through these conversations and through interacting with a work of art, which is really amazing. And I think that it's such an amazing thing to teach our students, that art can be there when bad things happen. So Harry Potter and Sacred Text, after the shooting in Orlando, the nightclub shooting, they started out the episode with a reading from book 4 after Cedric Diggory was killed. And they started out the episode with a reading from book 4 after Cedric Diggory was killed. And, we could use those words of Dumbledore from that reading to help us understand the world and connect with the world. And I think we can do that with art as well. And they talk about in the podcast that, when bad things happen in your life, you can go to books that you love and movies that you love and songs that you love and artwork that you love to help you feel better. So we can use art not just as a way to make social change, but just as a way to make us feel less alone in the world, and to use it and also just to use it as a comfort tool, as a distraction. And I think we can teach our students that art can be that for them, whether it is the making of art or it is looking at and appreciating art and experiencing art. So I want to think about a world where we can do this. And we can teach our students to look at art and make connections to it. And I think that really does start with just introducing more art into our students' lives and finding that connection. For our students who are not going to become artists or writers or dancers, we need to help them find ways to connect with art as a part of who they are and help them find meaning in the world and help them become more vulnerable and, help them understand that vulnerability is wonderful and good and to help them see themselves in a work of art. So I think about the Harry Potter podcast, and in that podcast, they do something called Lectio Divina. Now, if you're a member of the resource library, you might have already seen this. I did a video and a worksheet about this, and I also led this in some of my teacher trainings that I did over the summer, teacher workshops. But what Lectio Divina is they take a line from the text in the chapter and they really dig deep into that one line of text, and that you can get a lot from just a sentence. So they first go through the narrative of it. Where is that text in the context of the whole story? What's happening? Then they talk about any symbolic meaning in the text, any allegorical symbolic meanings that are referenced. But then they dive deeper into it. And in the step 3 of Lectio Divina, they talk about, what does it remind you of in your life? And then step 4 is, what are you called to do differently? They call it invitation. How are you going to use this, or how are you going to take what you discussed in this process or what you thought through during this process and do something differently in your life? So I thought, you can easily do that so I hear them do this with a piece of text, but I thought you can definitely do this with a work of art. So I tried it out and made a worksheet for it, and I put it up in the resource library, but I led a group of teachers through this at a workshop over the summer. We looked at a painting by Miguel Barceló, and it is called The Soup of Europe, and it is in the Meadows Museum. That's where my workshop was this summer. And in the painting, there is a man sitting in this sort of fancy European library. It has the golden frames on the ceiling and the sculptures, but he is sitting in front of this sort of big circle of confusing mess of black. And then there's a stack of books next to him, and then there's a globe next to him, and there's an open book, and he's looking very overwhelmed and frustrated. And his whole back is to this library, but then the whole painting is covered with this sort of black grime, but there's gold sort of coming through from behind, and you can see where the artist sort of scraped through to find that gold as an underpainting. I'll put a link in the show notes of this painting. The show notes link is artclasscurator.com/18. And if you want to see this painting, I will put a link to it in the show notes, artclasscurator.com/18. So with this artwork, we first talked about the narrative. What do we see going on? We talked, we listed that it was the books, and we talked about the fact that he was in a library. We talked about he's got this sort of weird plate of, I don't know how to explain it. It's like this void of texture with there's a bottle cap mixed in there. And it's really, you need to go look at the painting to see, especially if you live in the Dallas area, you need to go check it out in person because it's so much better in person than it is on the screen. So we talked through the narrative of the painting, what we see is going on. Then we talked about the symbols. So we talked about what could the globe represent? What could the books represent? What could this plate of mess in front of him represent? What could his emotions, all of these things that that these things are symbols for bigger things. The globe being maybe overwhelm or vastness of the world, or it could mean opportunity. So we talked about all the different possibilities for that connection. And then I had the participants write their personal connections to this artwork. And I didn't make them share, but a lot of them did share, which I was very grateful for. But my own personal connection was, I get so bogged down in my work that I forget to notice the beauty around me sometimes, that I'm just too busy focusing on getting the next task done that I miss parts of life, but then another teacher talked about how she moved from Rhode Island to Texas. And one thing that she missed, or that when she moved to Texas, she was in a much bigger house, but what she really missed from back home was the New York pizza. And she was reminded of the stacks of books reminded her of pizza boxes. And so she was connecting to that particular moment in her life. And then we went even deeper and we talked about, what are we going to do differently? Now that we've looked at this artwork, we've spent time connecting with it. We've made a personal connection to it. We see how it relates to our lives. What are we going to do differently in our life? And so we talked about how we're going to look for the beauty in the world, that we're going to try not to be so overwhelmed, especially at the start of the school year, and a lot of different things like that, just through looking at this one work of art. So this is a little bit challenging. And I was with adults, of course, when I did this. So I understand that with your younger ones, they're not going to have such profound, deeper meanings to the artwork, even though they will, and many of them will. But that, I think it's worth exploring and it's worth trying and finding ways to connect. So whether it is, how does this artwork relate to your life? Or what does this artwork remind you of in your life or your story? And then doing journaling and being very introspective. I have a blog post on my website about artworks that are good for introspection. So you can check that out. I'll put that link in the show notes too, where, we can look at an artwork and then reflect on some sort of area of our life. And I think that's such a good skill to teach people how to cope with the world, that they can cope through other means than turning to unhealthy means, Because really humans were making art before we could do anything else. So we made art before we could write. We made art before we had government systems and agriculture. And, art is very basic to the core of our being. And I think we need to find that and embrace that. And of course, we're prime roles of that, living that day-to-day connection to art. And yes, our job is to teach our students the content of art, the art history or the elements of principles or whatever, the techniques of art, but that we need to make sure we're not leaving out that personal connection, because that's how we're going to become better people and connect with the world. And it's just really so very important. So I want to start this conversation and I want more ideas. So please give me your comments and feedback on what ideas you have to make this happen in your life. Because really, in that same vein, artists throughout time have created artwork in response to tragedy. I mean, you think of Guernica and how Picasso, who never made any political art, his art was all about, mothers and women and children and still lives and things like that. And how something big in the world sparked Guernica, like a bombing. And then he turned to this painting that is so intense and filled with pain and horror. And you think of Botero, the Colombian artist who his paintings he's the one that paints the fat people, that he tries, it's kind of like a cubist idea. He's trying to show them from all angles. And so he makes them bigger. But, his artwork was more, I don't know what the right word is, of not political in a way. But then, the Abu Ghraib prison torture scandal, he created a series of really intense art about that political event. And you think of Frida Kahlo and showing her pain and her own personal pain in her artwork, that artists are responding to their own personal pain and also the pain of the world. And, there's Prisoners of War by Goya. There's so much art throughout history is connecting with this. And if we can tap into that and we can get our students to tap into that, then, it's only going to create a better world. So I invite you to really think about what artworks that you turn to. What artworks do you personally connect with and that make you feel better about the world, but also make you be a better person? What songs do you listen to? What shows do you watch? And how do you use art to cope with tragedy and cope with your job and to cope with your struggles of your personal life and turn into that? Use art as a way to connect and heal and teach your students to do the same thing, because art is love and art is just a part of who we are. So continuing to think about art in times of tragedy, I've talked about using art as a way to console yourself, as a distraction, as a comfort, but also I think it's important to take what we glean from these interactions with art and then to do something. So in the last stage of Lectio Divina, they talk about, well, what are you going to do now? And I think that's the important thing, is that we think about what we're going to do and think about our role in the world and how we can make a difference in the world, and that we don't want to drown ourselves in our sorrows and we don't want to drown ourselves in distraction, that we need to do and we need to act. And art can be a way to do that. I know that in my experience as a teacher, I was a little scared to do social justice type of activities. We feel like we're going to get in trouble for infusing our politics or something onto a class, or, there's so many little political things that we have to look out for. So I don't know the right answers. I'm going to help look for some good resources for you to embrace this idea if you're interested. But, I think we can start with showing artworks to our students where artworks that did make a change and that did make a difference. I'm thinking of, there's an artist in Lebanon, Shoker. I don't know how to say her name exactly. I wrote a blog post on her and how, her art was this sort of abstract art, but then it was in a bombing. And so there's like shards of glass and stuff in it. There's a lot of things like that where we can look at the art and talk about the world around it. And we can do it in sort of a safe way, and that kids can see how art is used to make a difference without having to infuse our political views onto our students, which, we all have different political views, and that is absolutely fine. But I think these conversations need to be had. And that's really a starting place for me. I was in a Facebook group recently, and we were talking about race and how some people were getting upset that one teacher mentioned that she was a white woman teaching in an all-black school. And some people were like, that's great that she had the bravery to say, I'm in this situation and I want to do good by my students. But there are cultural things at play to help that are going to keep me from doing that. I want to figure out the right way. But then other people were saying, how dare you talk about race, and it has nothing to do with teaching. And so it's just this whole thing. But we have to have these conversations. We can't not have these conversations. We can't pretend that these things don't exist. We can't pretend that kids are not being killed around the country unnecessarily. And we need to find ways to make our voices heard. And to do that, I think we have to start with ourselves, and we have to start with each other and the communities that we live in and the relationships that we have, and that we have to have the conversation. And I think art gives us a way to do that in a more safe way. When I first outlined this episode, I was preparing to interview Jim O'Donnell for episode 9 of the Art Class Curator Podcast. It's actually one of my favorite episodes, and it's one of the most popular episodes. So I definitely recommend you go check that out. But as I was preparing for that episode, I came across a blog post written by Jim about the school shooting in Florida at Stoneman Douglas High School. And he wrote so beautifully about his experience after the fact and how he talked to his students about this, as well as his own personal experience as a high school student and what impact art had on him. So I asked Jim for this episode. So I teased at the beginning of this episode that I had a special guest for you, and I do. Here is Jim O'Donnell from Kill Your Color Wheels, and he is going to read for us the blog post that I'm talking about, and we'll link to it below as well. But I just really want to thank Jim for opening up about his experience and for helping teachers be vulnerable and students be vulnerable and sharing our experiences, because only great power and connection can come from such activities. So without further ado, I welcome Jim. And this is just a warning that the following story does include references to violence and abuse, so listener discretion is advised.
The following is edited from a blog post originally published February 20th, 2018. By Jim O'Donnell. Teaching art helps me be my best self. Making art requires vulnerability. So if I want my students to be comfortable sharing their most authentic selves in their art making, they need to see me being vulnerable as well. But I had no idea that a national tragedy would call upon me to muster all of the authenticity, vulnerability, and honesty I could for the sake of my students. On the afternoon of Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2018, 17 students and teachers were shot dead at Stoneman Douglas High School in Lakeland, Florida by a gunman with a semi-automatic rifle. I went to high school about 45 minutes away from there. According to conservative estimates, this was the 5th school shooting in 2018. That's almost one incident per week so far. This was only a few days ago, and every school and learning community in the country has been hurt in some way as a result. When I first heard the news, I wanted to throw up. I cried. Over the next few days, I cried several times each day, in fact. Maybe I too had become desensitized to the continuous stream of mass shootings in America, and it was all finally coming to a head. This seemed like something more than common empathy and a loose connection to the area for me. I wasn't expecting to react as strongly as I was. And in rereading that sentence, How could we let things get to this point where I would say I either should have expected such an event or not felt so strongly about it? I was sick to my stomach, a little out of it, and heartbroken for those children that would no longer graduate and go on to live the rest of their promising lives. For those teachers that gave their lives to protect their students. I couldn't go on as usual and pretend that every teacher and every student in this country had not just been stabbed through the heart. I couldn't process our shared grief alone. If I was experiencing such difficult emotions, then I guess that some of my students may feel the same, or worse. They might be asking themselves, why am I going into this field? Do I really want to become a teacher? Sure, we've all had those moments, but most of us weren't worried that we might die doing the job we love. It is most often our hearts, our love of children, the world, and learning that lead us to this profession, but also that make us the most vulnerable. That our children might be the price of our national inaction, of our shared failure to come together and make a difference again and again, is appalling. As future teachers, the real world won't stop at my students' classroom doors. And it can't stop at mine either. So I decided to change my plans. I decided to improvise. We would talk and share and make art together. And maybe, just maybe, that will make a small difference. I asked them to check in with themselves and to find out how they were feeling. I told them we would be improvising and getting real. And if at any point they found that our conversation was too much for them, they could step outside or leave at any time if that was what they needed. Then I opened up. I feel awful, I said. I told them why. I feel heartbroken and angry at the same time. I described the pit in my gut, the weight on my chest, and the nausea in my stomach. I don't know how to talk about this, I said, but we're going to talk about it anyway. I'm not a counselor. I'm not qualified. And you won't be either, but that's okay. There may come a time, if it hasn't already, that you will have to talk to your children about things they should never have to think about. But we can still do some good. I reminded them of the counseling services available at school and the contact information I included prominently in our course syllabus. Counseling is for everyone, and you don't need to feel a certain way to see a counselor. While sometimes it takes time to find a good match, as with anything, I wanted to destigmatize mental health services. So I shared that in my early 30s, a cognitive psychologist helped me acquire tools that have helped me become a little bit healthier. And I'll always be grateful. I also told them about last semester, the best friend of a student in my class that had been wounded in the Las Vegas massacre. Is that horrific event fading from our memory already? Back then, I began class by mentioning the event, reminding the students about the counseling services, and after a brief pause, moving on with the scheduled lesson. We all signed a card for the student in the class. Why didn't I change my plans then? What did I think was more important? I feel a little ashamed, but today was going to be different. Then I told them a story, my story. The story of a child that grew up in extreme circumstances and was part of an invisible population, namely students that are homeless and surviving a dysfunctional family, struggling with mental illness, alcohol, and shame. I told them how I had been emotionally, psychologically, and physically abused for years, starting when I was 8 years old. I was held back a year simply because I wasn't even allowed to go to school for most of that year. By the time I was 12, I was an antisocialized, severely obese, unhygienic child with dirty clothes. I was a pariah, isolated at school, a mysterious but obvious target of ridicule and isolation by teachers and classmates, and completely on my own at home, trapped inside the delusions of a mentally ill parent. I was lonely, sad, confused, filling with rage. I admitted to having fantasized about my own death many times back then. How vividly I imagined everyone in my school lamenting my preventable death at my funeral. They would finally regret having ever been mean to me or excluding me, I thought. At home, I was being told that these people were my enemies and out to get me, adding fuel to the fire. I admitted how, during a particularly low point, I had fantasized about getting back at all my classmates that had hurt me by transforming into a giant robot and gunning them all down in cold-blooded revenge. I didn't care who I hurt because I was hurting so badly I couldn't feel that human connection. Eventually I came out the other side, damaged but unbroken. No one should ever have to know those feelings I felt as a child. Those feelings are something I will have to carry with me for the rest of my life. And every time another horrific shooting occurs in this country, I'm back at that time of my life again, reliving all of those terrible memories. I consider myself lucky. I can't say why or how I survived all that. Part nature, part nurture, and a lot of luck, I assume. But for a slight twist of fate, I told my students, I could easily have ended up in prison or dead. But a huge part of what helped me survive, I believe, was art. When I was younger, I escaped to my drawings. I constructed an elaborate comic book universe complete with storylines and characters, drawing and redrawing them over and over. And I improved slowly. As I got older and took charge of more and more of my life, I learned that the world could be different than the one I had been told. It was then that my art became a connection to others, a way of reaching out. Would you believe that by 7th grade, in the same class I described before, that I gave everyone their own personalized drawing just to thank them for being my classmates at the end of the year? I did the same thing in 8th grade. Art was there to help me when few others could. I told my students how later in high school, the first drawings I made that I considered quote-unquote art were created one summer as I tried to process feelings resulting from an incident with a broken door, blood on a bedsheet, and another family member's fist reeking of alcohol. I can't remember ever being angrier in my life than I was that night. I paced back and forth like an animal in a cage, desperate to release my rage. I wanted to steal a car, drive it into a tree, die, or end up in jail. I wanted to overdose, even though I'd never even touched a drug. I wanted to do anything I could to get back at my attacker by hurting myself, but I was isolated yet again, this time on a mountain with nothing around for miles. Instead of going for a weapon, I picked up colored pencils, drew. I drew what was inside and let it out on paper. I discovered a tool that would help me the rest of my life. Art, I believe, can save lives. And art just doesn't help us survive, it can help us thrive, as it enables us to process life and the world around us, even when we experience emotions to which we can't give names or describe. By coming together around art, we come to understand and accept each other a little bit more. So for the rest of that class, we painted and doodled and just enjoyed spending time together. My students seem okay for the most part, but they shared their own stories of sadness, paranoia, fear, trauma, what it's like to explain to kindergartners why they have to pretend to hide from a bad man that has come to hurt them. My generation never experienced anything like that. This generation is resilient, I tell them. And don't let any of these other generations disrespect you, because this is their mess, my mess, and we aren't cleaning it up. But we have to do something. Only a few of my students spoke publicly, but we listened deeply, and everyone was heard. Through our sharing, we became closer, and our little community grew stronger. I've done the best I can do. That's all any teacher can expect from themselves. I was honest with my students, and I hopefully gave them an example of what to do when they don't know what to do. Isn't that all any teacher wants? And more so, maybe I gave them some hope that, like in my life, it's possible to turn things around. We're not destined for an endless string of tragedies. I showed them that we can be damaged, but that doesn't mean we have to be broken. And maybe they'll remember that making art can bring us joy and support us in grief. And for some of us, art might even be the reason we're here today. I still want to cry sometimes. My eyes are welling up as I write these words, but we can either present ourselves to our students as products or processes. For their sake, I think they need to see the process, because we are all learning to live in this world together. And they need to see that sometimes it's messy and we don't know what to do. And that's all right. And we need to see that we're all in this together, because it's easy to become cynical or bury my head in the sand. But the self I most want to be for my students is the one that believes our world is a work of art in process. Thank you for listening. To all my teachers, friends, followers, and colleagues, both known and unknown, keep being the kind, strong, brave, authentic, vulnerable, and beautiful creatures I know you are. We need each other now more than ever. And to everyone, take care of each other, because that will make the world the one we want to live in and the one our students deserve. I believe we can make that world a reality, but only together.
Thanks again to Jim for sharing his experiences with us. I feel very lucky to have made this friend, and I feel very lucky to learn from him, and I hope you guys feel the same way. I like to end my episodes with the question, which artwork changed your life? And I've shared my story before, and I have many artworks that have changed my life. But I invite you to think about that question for yourself. So if you have not answered that question, which artwork changed your life. I want to hear it. I want you to think about it, and I would love to hear it. Please submit your story to which artwork changed your life. If you go to the show notes at artclasscurator.com/18, there'll be a link to submit your story. All you have to do is create a voice memo of yourself telling your story on your phone, and then you can send it to me at cindy@artclasscurator.com, or you can use the online form on the show notes. We would love to hear your stories, and I would love to end each podcast with an extra story of which artwork changed your life, because the more we see art being an important role in people's lives, the more connected I think we'll feel with each other and as art teachers, and also to art as a whole. Art changes my life all the time. Hamilton, when I first heard it, changed my life. It changed my life when I saw it in Chicago. It changed my life again when I saw it in Houston. So depending on what's going on in my life, it's calling me to different things depending on where I am. So I saw it in October 2016. I was in a different place than I was in May of 2018. So we can come back to art again and again, and we can learn from it. So please think about that question for yourself and share your story if you're comfortable. We would love to hear it, and we would love to hear your voice. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and give us an honest rating on iTunes. This will help other teachers find us and hear these amazing stories. Do you want even more art inspiration? Sign up for Art Class Curator's once-a-week email newsletter, Your Weekly Art Break. Teacher Sarah Warnock says, I truly do take a break from my busy week to check all your links and feel inspired. Everything you share is relevant, meaningful, and also super helpful. You definitely help me become a better art teacher, and I look forward to your emails each week. You can sign up at artclasscurator.com/artbreak. And as a free gift for subscribing, you'll get 6 free art interpretation worksheets to use in your classroom. Be sure to tune in next week for more inspiring art interviews. All right, that is it for today's episode of the Art Class Curator Podcast. Next week, we're going to continue the vulnerability train, and we're going to talk with Amber Jordan and Monica Wright about being an introvert and also being a highly sensitive person, and also dealing with anxiety as a teacher. So if you fit any of those categories, they're not all one and the same, I invite you to listen to our conversation, and at the very least, it will help you feel a little bit less alone in your world as a teacher. And we're going to talk about our strategies for dealing with the highly stressful job of being a teacher. Thank you so very much for listening and considering these thoughts that I gave you today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.